Hello and welcome to a new episode of Ghoulish. I am Max Booth, a host, and this is a evergreen podcast discussing all things spooky. If you think it's spooky, then by golly, we're probably going to talk about it eventually in some episode down the line, or maybe we have already spoken about it. Just look at the previous episodes we've done. This intro is not going well. Today I am talking with Grady Hendrix, a man who has written many books you've probably read already. He's a pretty good big name. He's also a good talented writer and a funny man. Today we're talking about vampires to celebrate the release of his New York Times best-selling novel that just came out not that long ago called The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. I think that's the title. I don't have it in front of me. I am almost positive. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. Because, you know, sometimes you get vampires and you gotta slay them. You gotta slay them good. So, yeah, that's what I'm talking about today, and I'm talking about it with Grady Hendrix. So I hope you dig the episode, and you go and buy his book. Before we begin, I'm going to recommend two other books as well, because most of you probably know I run a publishing company, and we just released a brand new novella called The Grill and the Video by Michael David Wilson that just came out last month in April. You should go pick it up. It's available any place you can buy books. I recommend bookshop.org. Also, a little tooting of my own horn. I just also released a new novella by myself called We Need to Do Something, which is about a family stuck in a bathroom. Sounds exciting? It is. It's a fucking thriller minute. But there's no vampires in it. Do you know what does have vampires in it? The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Let's talk about vampires now. With guess who? Grady Hendrix. Alright. So Grady, do you want to talk about vampires with me?
Sure. I mean, I feel like I've been talking about vampires for 2 years now. So yeah, I'm happy to continue.
Are you completely sick of it by now?
No, I'm not sick of it. I just, you feel like you talk about something for long enough and eventually it changes. And I feel like I'm talking about vampires and people still think of them as sparkle dudes with really good abs.
I bet you probably get a lot of Twilight questions, don't you?
I don't get so much Twilight questions, I think, because most people have read the book. But definitely when I was doing this book, I mean, my publisher did not want to do it because it was a vampire book, and they really had to be. They took a lot of pushing to persuade them.
How did you convince them to go ahead with it?
Well, it was they didn't want to do a book about a vampire, and they didn't want to do a book about, they were like, who's going to be interested in a bunch of middle-aged women sort of sitting around talking about their kids. They were like, I mean, books like that are popular, but we don't sell those kind of books. And I think what happened was it was my editors, it was my last book on my contract with them, and my editor kind of felt like, hey, I'd been talking about this book for a long time, and why not? Let's give it a shot. And then everyone was pretty horrified by it. I mean, I remember my agent was appalled by the first draft, and it it was a real uphill. We Sold Our Souls was a lot harder, but this one was sort of a more of an uphill battle to get people to see the book I had in my head years ago when I first started wanting to do this.
You would think from the title alone that it's going to be mostly this upbeat novel, but oh my god, it gets deep, man.
It's a little dark, yeah. When I felt really bad when what happened to one of the characters happens to her in the last third of the book. I remember realizing that was going to be the turn it took, and I just thought, oh boy, that's a bummer.
How did the publisher react to that one?
Oh, not at all badly, actually. They were, by that point, we were so far down the road. It was kind of like, um, they didn't have any negative reaction at all. And I was the one who actually, originally the book was a third person omniscient point of view, and so actually that attack got related first, but sort of almost first person, third person limited, but as it happened. And I realized that I really need to commit to Patricia as the point of view character, so I would have the attack related to her. And I actually think that made it more effective. Watching a character struggle to say something that's so appalling to her, I think really worked better than describing it happening. It's one of those, it's like that rule actors get, that if you play drunk, you've screwed the scene up. What you need to do is you need to play someone trying very, very hard not to be drunk. And so having someone unable to say certain things, was a lot more effective than describing it in a very like clinical kind of way.
I agree. I think the book benefits greatly from not being in that Pilson's point of view during that moment.
Yeah.
That was a great
And
choice.
oh, thanks. And it's funny. That attack wasn't going to happen in the book for a lot of reasons until very late in the game. And what's interesting to me is that's really the reason one of the reasons I decided to write this book. When I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, and in the late 80s, early 90s, I think there was a serial rapist who in about 2 years attacked, gosh, I think it was something like 25 women. I mean, it really was an attack almost every month. And I remember how terrified people were because people would be downstairs having dinner and someone would go to use the upstairs bathroom and he'd have come through an upstairs window and be waiting for them. He, just seemed to be able to go anywhere and get in anywhere. And it was really horrifying. And he was a real sick individual. I mean, not that you need, of course he is, but there was he actually attacked raped a 13-year-old girl, and then 6 to 8 weeks later came back and raped her mom while the girl was asleep in the next room, asked her in the middle how her daughter was doing, and then left. And and it's really tragic code to the whole thing. A family friend bought them a gun to protect themselves with if they ever came back. And ultimately what happened was the guy got pulled over for a traffic violation. I think he ran a stop sign, and the officer recognized him as the person, or the car, I think, as the one that was wanted in connection with these rapes. And there was a high-speed chase, and the serial rapist lost control of his car and hit, I think, a tree and got brain damage and was in a coma. And ultimately, I believe in a first round of trials, he was found guilty, but there was he wasn't able to stand. I think that's it. He wasn't able to stand trial because of the brain damage. And the girl, the one he had attacked, the 13-year-old, used the gun they'd been given as protection to kill herself. And then later, the judge believed that the guy was faking his vegetative state and his brain damage and insisted that he stand trial or he'd put a camera in his hospital room to record him to make sure he wasn't faking. And he immediately presented himself for trial and was prosecuted. And I think he was either killed or killed himself in prison a couple of years later. So it was this really hideous story. I mean, I'm sure everyone's really bummed out right now. And but it had a huge impact on me as a kid because I just saw the fear that this guy sowed. He didn't murder anyone. He wasn't, and that was one of the things that always sort of bummed me out about movies, right? You had these serial killer films where they'd kill like 13 people, then 15 people, and then the next one they killed 100 people. And you had in horror this sort of arms race, this escalation of the body count. And I had seen this guy do so much more damage to a community and not murder anyone. And it stuck with me ever since. And that was one of the things where with James Harris sort of going into people's houses and being around their family that I found so upsetting to me writing this is that it brought back memories of that time. And I was trying to sort of channel that atmosphere into it. That was a really long question answer. Sorry.
I wasn't expecting any of that. I do find interesting that he couldn't take the idea of being filmed in the hospital. He immediately caved. You would think he would have tried to fake it at least.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where I think it's very easy to sort of Monday morning quarterback this stuff. But I mean, this was like no one was kidding around. And I think even he realized no one was fooling around at that point. As much as he had an instinct for self-preservation, I think it became very clear to he and his lawyers that this was not a time to try something.
How old were you when this was all going on?
Probably I was, I think 17, 18. Because I remember I was able to drive at night. You can only do that after 16 in South Carolina. And I remember that, one of the things that keeps happening in the book are these scenes where, someone will be outside and it'll be really windy and dark and very lonely. And I remember walking to my car a few times in a parking lot. I wasn't about to be attacked, but there was this real atmosphere of depression and kind of terror over the entire city. And I remember walking to my car a few times and feeling that kind of like, you're the only person in the world except for someone who's watching you right at that minute. And really at my house, the thing I dreaded more than anything was taking out the garbage because you had to ultimately go around the side of the house to get the cans where it was so dark and terrifying. And I could never get my act together to get them out of there before dark. And then you'd have to roll them to the end of the street. And that was this long walk. And we had all this bamboo and all these groves. And it was very shadowy and very dark. And there was one street light at the street. So it cast these really harsh shadows everywhere else. Like everything was that much darker. And there were nights, because we lived on the water, like the house in the book, where the wind would just be whipping and you couldn't hear anything. And that was the scariest, loneliest, darkest walk back from the street to the house or from the house to the street. I remember taking out the garbage.
Yeah, I had a similar thing when I was a kid with the taking out the trash. We had a long driveway, but I was mostly afraid of raccoons. I lived in the Midwest in Indiana, and I was always terrified of coming up to the cans as a raccoon was feasting, which was often.
Oh yeah,
Those things will
they're not
feisty.
fooling around. Yeah, they're vicious, man, and rabid.
Yeah,
We're in the
isn't
Midwest.
Indiana?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you, but you kind of already answered how the community changed when all this was going on. Did like in movies when something like this happens, the town kind of shuts down. Nobody goes out. Everyone goes on this curfew. Was that similar to your real life experience?
There wasn't so much, like it wasn't organized, but yeah, in a way, everyone just started not taking chances. Everyone started going out in groups or walking people to their cars and making sure they got in and got the doors locked. So yeah, it wasn't an official order, but it was this feeling that you lock the doors and the windows after dark.
Man, that's creepy.
It was a weird time. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Well, I'm going to ask you a question I bet you get asked in every interview lately. What introduced you to vampires?
Gosh, I've never been a huge vampire fan. I think the vampires that made the most impact on me, well, really, there were two. One was Near Dark. I saw Near Dark when I was in middle school, I think, and that this idea of vampires as sort of these cowboys, as these working class blue collar drifters in the Southwest, it really jived with the image of the serial killer. Then, these sort of Henry Lee Lucas and the like, these roughnecks kind of drifting out west, and that ties into the American cowboy image and all that. And then the other one is my grandmother was always scared of vampires for some reason. And she was not like a superstitious woman. And my middle sister was terrified of vampires. And she had this dream she used to describe, or this nightmare really, where she would imagine that a vampire would come to our house and then stand at the front door, and his arms would stretch through the house and sort of follow her wherever she tried to hide, these
Oh
like
my God.
long spaghetti arms. Yeah. And I think that really stuck with me because she really liked describing that nightmare a lot.
I think I'm gonna have that nightmare now. Jesus, that's like a vampire slash Freddy Krueger dream.
Yeah, with a little Cthulhu tentacles thrown in there.
Yikes. With me, I was trying to think about this before we began Skyping, and I can't recall what introduced me to vampires, but I would say it's most likely a tie between a Fright Night, The Lost Boys, and From Dusk Till Dawn. And that made me
Yeah.
it made me laugh thinking about that last movie because as a kid, I my mom didn't give me any limits of what I could and could not watch. So we would watch that movie a lot when I was really young. But the only thing I could not watch in a movie was nudity. And that the whole last half of From Dusk Till
Yeah.
Dawn is at a strip club. So I remember just having to close my eyes for the second half of the movie, and I would always wonder, well, what is going on in this movie? Turns out it was vampires.
So she would trust you to self-censor while you were watching?
No, I would have. I mean, I we would all watch the movies in the living room.
Got it, got it, got it. Okay, I was gonna say that's some amazing parenting.
Yeah, no, I had to have my hands on my head. It's just amusing. Why even let me watch a movie like that specifically?
Right. Yeah, it's funny. I wasn't allowed to watch R-rated movies as a kid, and gradually you get away from that. And there was never when the rule was officially lifted, but definitely it was something that was not okay.
It's really amusing to think about now. What type of experience do you have with book clubs? How did you come upon this idea of writing about a book club in the 90s?
Well, my mom's book club, I believe they're like in their 40th or 41st year right now. So they've been around since I was a kid, and I really hated them as a kid because they were just a bunch of loud moms, and they would drink wine, which when you're a kid and you don't drink, you're very judgmental about. And I just thought they were a bunch of nobodies, and they would come into the house and I couldn't go downstairs, and they really just wrecked my evening. And I got to know a lot of these women as adults and as people separate than their identity as so and so's mom or so and so who drives the carpool. And I really realized that there's a lot of stuff they dealt with that was, pretty heavy stuff. I mean, like everyone does, but they'd made sure their kids didn't know about it because I guess that's the job, right? When you're a parent, like you take the hits, so your kid doesn't take the hits. And it really, I wanted to sort of write a book that replicated that experience I had going from thinking you had these women's number and being very dismissive of them to really having a lot of respect for them. And so a book club was, and I also, when you're an adult, it's harder to find friends and make those friendships. And I think you do things like join a book club or a sewing circle or a church to have those social connections. So a book club made a lot of sense.
Any idea if they ever got a bit suspicious of anyone new in the neighborhood and investigated?
No, never ever. But one of the things that was big in my neighborhood was if you saw a car you didn't know, you would write down its license plate. Or if someone thought a car had slowed down in front of your house and they didn't know them, they would call you and tell you what had happened. So it was really, it was a bit weird. Everyone was sort of Jimmy Stewart and Rear Window.
I guess if they did kill a vampire, they wouldn't have told you, huh?
Exactly. As far as I know, they didn't, but what do I know?
Yeah. I know you mentioned this. Maybe it was in the intro of the book. I can't recall now how, with the original, not the original novel, my best friend's exorcism. You wrote it from the point of view of these teens and the 80s, I want to say, or the
Yeah,
90s. Okay,
88.
yeah, and then with this new book, he kind of wanted to flip the table and write it from the parents' perspective because in my best friend's exorcism, the the position of parents are seen as kind of snobby and they don't know anything, but it's just the kid's perspective. And I thought that was pretty cool how you kind of swapped that around in an effective way.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's it's funny. It's really easy to be a teenager and judge everything. And I mean, I certainly did when I was a teenager and you think no one else is quite as incredible as you and these friendships are really intense and I think it's easy to get on board with that. And I think as an adult, it's all a little bit harder. You tend to, understand that other people have a point of view, even if it's one you don't agree with. Friendships are, I think, more stable and long lasting, but they don't run quite as hot. And I think and you put up with people a lot more. Like, I have friends who, I mean, we're friends, but I do a lot of tolerating of them. And I assume they do a lot of tolerating of me because when you're a teenager and your best friend doesn't like the same album you do, it's a earth-shaking crisis. When you're an adult, it's like your best friend may have completely different politics, raise their children, like everything they do might be different, but you stay friends because you know what that's the value of that is, and you know that this is someone who's going to be there when the rubber meets the road. Your friends as an adult are more likely to save your life. Your friends as a teenager are probably more likely to save your soul.
That's a great way to think about it. All right, let's talk about vampires. Specifically, what is a vampire? Now, I mean, I want to get super technical. Now, a vampire, they crave blood. Do we know why?
Well, okay, so everyone's got a different vampire, right? I mean, I'm looking at a bunch of vampire stuff right now for a show, and um, it's I mean, there's vampire rings, there's vampire chairs, there's vampire flowers, there's vampire trees, there's alien vampires, female vampires, child vampires, baby vampires, bagpipe-shaped vampires. I mean, so there's really all kinds of vampires, and so to make mine up, I felt like the essential question was supernatural or not, and I went not, and so instantly there's none of the religious stuff, right? You're not scared of crosses. You obviously cast a shadow. You have a reflection, and you can't turn into a bat. You can't turn into mist, but you can be strong. You can be very, very long lived. And the blood thing's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, you have to, I mean, that's an essential component, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of early vampires, like 18th century and 17th century and 16th century vampires, they don't really always suck blood. They attack people, they kill them. They're found with blood still in them, which is how you know they're a vampire if you dig them up. But they don't necessarily drink it. But the blood thing, at least I think since the 19th century, has been a huge part of vampire lore. But the problem is a human being doesn't have enough calories in their blood supply for really anyone to live on for more than a couple of days. So I had to be like, I wanted my vampire. I didn't want them to be killing someone every, twice a week. I mean, that's really noticeable. How would you live more than 20 or 30 years? And so I had to figure out another reason for them to need the human blood supply. And so my answer was that, they don't have bone marrow, they don't have white blood cells. So they have to filter the waste in their blood that builds up through a human circulatory system. So I don't know if that's an entirely satisfactory answer, but I feel like it's with a hand wave and a bunch of mumbo jumbo away from being satisfactory.
Before we move on, you mentioned a bagpipe-shaped vampire. I'm not going to let you just skip across that. What do you mean by that?
Oh yeah, well no, I mean it's exactly what it sounds like. It's I think it was a gosh, I think it was a story called The Blood Snare, I believe. And it's from the 80s and it was a short story. And yeah, the vampires, I believe they're aliens, but they look like these sacks with these pipes coming off of them. And I believe, and I could have it wrong. It's been a while since I read it, but I believe they communicate with this kind of like piping kind of noise.
That sounds awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it was, it's funny. It's one of those stories I tracked down because I'd heard about the vampire bagpipe thing in it, and it was it was fine when I read it, but it was a lot. It wasn't quite as cool as I wanted it to be. I wanted vampires disguised as bagpipes, and I didn't quite get that. Um, there's another story. Gosh, what is it? I'm gonna get the title of it so wrong. What is it? Oh, Bill Pronzini, the mystery writer and editor, had written this story about how like a vampire eats everyone on Earth, and then he's the only thing left, and like so he's starving to death, and he summons Satan, and to make a deal. And Satan's like, well, I'll make a deal with you. But then the vampire just attacks him and sucks his blood and takes on Satan's powers. And then he uses Satan's powers to create life like Adam and Eve. And so the thing you realize is like God is a vampire. And that's great. And then I track the story down and it's really just like a one-page kind of like joke story that's written with sort of an elbow in the ribs punniness, and I was really bummed. I was like, oh, this is going to be such a dark nihilistic story, and it's a little bit like gosh, there's a story called The Curse of Hooligans Bar from the 70s where there's a vampire leprechaun in a bar who gets mistaken for an olive and staked with a toothpick, which I have problems with because it's like that's a tiny leprechaun. Like I think of a leprechaun as 1 to 2 feet tall. That's a big olive.
God, that would be just my luck to finally become a vampire, but to get mistaken as an olive.
Yeah, exactly.
It sucks that they didn't end. They didn't quench that need that you had, but at least it's kind of fun to talk about.
Oh yeah, I mean, all these stories are interesting, and one of the things, I mean, one of the reasons I write books is I'll track this stuff down, and it's never as cool as I want it to be. So I'm always like, oh, okay, I guess I'll have to do my version.
Now I'm imagining James in the book you wrote being shaped like a bagpipe and just playing music, and the book club is like that guy is obviously a vampire, and all the husbands all
Exactly.
like, "What do you mean? He's fine. Leave him alone."
Or yeah, a vampire Scotsman or something.
That's obviously a small olive. No, he's a businessman. Leave him alone.
Exactly.
That's another thing you do frustratingly well in the novel is the fact that husbands were assholes in the 90s.
Well, they weren't all. And so, okay, so this is, I think there's two things here. One is that, I mean, a lot of the husbands that I know pretty well in the book, like Kitty's husband, Horse, and Mary Ellen's husband, they're actually really nice guys. But just everything with them in it got cut because winds up being solely from Patricia's point of view. So you really only see Carter, and Carter is sort of a narcissist, and he's not quite a terrible dude. I mean, he is, but like I feel like there wasn't any pressure on guys in the 90s to really step back and kind of take a look at themselves. Like we were all in agreement that domestic violence, like physical abuse was bad and absolutely wrong. But like emotional abuse, that was still up in the air. Like was that just complaining? Were you just looking for problems, or was that really a thing? And what was it? And then like even beyond that, like, what's sort of, the idea of male privilege or toxic masculinity, that stuff was not even conceived of. And so these guys seem so unaware and unwoke by our standards, but really they're like they're par for the course at the time, and so I hate hanging them out to dry like that, but it makes for good scenes.
It made for great scenes, and it's fiction. I think they'll be okay.
Exactly.
Um, are you familiar with the website wikihow.com?
Oh, yeah, yeah, sure.
Okay, so I want to talk about a page I found 5 minutes before we Skyped called
Okay.
How to Date a Vampire.
Oh, how to date one. Okay.
Okay, so I'm just going to walk through the steps, and if you have any comments or if you disagree with anything, just let me know.
Okay.
Step 1, choose a vampire you are attracted to and can see yourself dating. So, dating someone.
That's
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Dating someone who is into the underground vampire community is like dating the ultimate bad boy who lives by his own rules. You need to really feel the attraction before you take that leap of faith. So several elements you should consider include the physical appearance. Although film and television vampires are the hottest creatures around, make sure you feel a physical attraction to your real life vampire before agreeing to go out for a bite. I mean, that seems to make sense.
Now, wait, I need some clarification. So, is this about dating actual vampires or about dating people who play vampire, the live action role playing game?
I'm choosing to believe actual vampires.
Okay, fair enough.
So we also have to consider the vampire's personality. Even though he or she may be hot, you will want a vampire who has it all: the charm, the intellect, and a sense of humor. Typically, those who dabble in vampirism are pretty open-minded and like to experiment. So chances are your date will have something interesting to bring to the date.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? I mean, these things are really important, and they become more important with the vampire because you're going to spend eternity together, right? Um, but at the same time, are you dating a vampire or are you looking to become a vampire? Because I think a lot of vampire dating happens with their food. And I think you have to be really special if you're going to become a vampire, get turned into one.
Yeah, that just reminded me of something. A typical trope you do see in vampire fiction that I believe you kind of avoided. Maybe you can talk about reasons why, if you even thought about it. Would be the Renfield trope, the having a servant dedicated to serving you in every whim.
Oh, yeah. Actually, there was a Renfield character in an early draft of the book because Carter is is a psychiatrist. And so one of his patients was going to be a Renfield character. But then I realized Renfield doesn't really do a whole lot in Dracula, the book. And there was really no need to have someone in this book who didn't do much. You know what I mean? Who I wasn't going to get a lot of use out of.
Yeah, that makes sense. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, like what he would have done. It just, I guess he becomes so used to seeing that maybe it stands out when you don't put one in, and that's not a bad thing at all. It's pretty cool to just have skipped that.
Yeah, well, it's also because you're right, like a lot of like lit the right one in, and a lot of those the vampire has a human helper, Salem's Lot, all that. And my vampire, because they're not supernatural, he's not going to burst into flames when he's out in the day. It's just going to be deeply, deeply uncomfortable for him. And so I thought, well, if he can go out in the day and he doesn't have all these supernatural restrictions, he doesn't really need a helper. And he's a loner. He's a predator. He's on his own. And so having a human helper would sort of like, I just felt like it undermined that. And you also then get into this whole thing about vampire sexuality, like Barlow and Straker in Salem's Lot, or Jerry. And I can't remember the human minion he has in Fright Night. But there's always this sort of like this like homoerotic thing between them. Even like this weird pedo tension between the vampire who's the little girl and let the right one in and her helper. And I don't know. That wasn't anything I was interested in writing about. Just because I feel like you said it's been done.
That's a good point.
I didn't have
Yeah.
anything new to bring to the table.
Yeah, that was a pretty uncomfortable and let the right one in, especially the book. The movie kind of hints at it, but the book.
The book's much more explicit.
Oh yeah. Okay, so another step from the WikiHow guide of how
Yeah.
to date a vampire. This is step 3. I'm skipping step 2. Step 3 is get used Get used to seeing your date drink blood. A huge part of the vampire movement is actually drinking blood. Human vampires will use a clean scalpel or knife to make a small incision on the victim's body before drinking the blood that is oozing from the wound. So, if your date wants to drink blood, you could politely decline, excuse yourself from the room, or watch and take notes.
Well, I mean, that just seems polite, right? You want to be, what is it, GGG, good giving and game? Like, someone has a fetish and you want to be with them, you've got to sort of embrace that fetish. It's part of the territory. Um, all that talk of scalpels reminds me of Martin, which is another really great vampire.
Oh, yeah, that's a great movie. I would argue maybe George Romero's best movie.
Oh yeah, I think absolutely his best movie. I mean, I love Dawn of the Dead much more than I love Martin, but I would say hands down Martin's his best movie.
I'm surprised that one hasn't seen like a Criterion release by now. It's difficult to find.
Yeah, well, one of Romero's producers is really protective of those films and really limits public screenings and really limits the video releases, from what I understand.
Oh, I didn't know that, but that would make sense because, yeah,
Yeah.
those movies are difficult. I lucked out by finding a copy of that movie at a half price books for $5.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
On VHS, on DVD?
DVD.
Oh, that must have been, was that, what was it, the Anchor Bay one they put out a long time ago? Or,
I think so. Yeah, I'm not
yeah.
positive off the top of my head, but that sounds right.
Yeah, I've only ever seen that movie on a really doopy VHS. And so I've never seen, oh, and I've seen it projected once, but I've never seen it in all its glory, restored.
Yeah. What do you think about? I mean, do you know much about the vampire movement? That's like, will people think they are vampires and they do drink blood?
I mean, a little bit, not a whole lot. It seems to be a lifestyle choice. I don't know enough to have an opinion. You know what I mean? It's to me, it's in the same category as Furbies or people who live like, any kind of like lifestyle like that. I just feel like, okay, well, if that's that important to you, you go right ahead.
Yeah. Do you have any other thoughts or last minute things you would like to say about this book or vampires at all?
No, I mean, just trying to think, really it was really, really hard to get a vampire book written. And one of the things that I think really helped me convince my publisher was talking about a vampire like a serial killer. And one of the big serial killer influences on this book was Anne Rule's The Stranger Beside Me, which is her first book, her true crime book about Ted Bundy. And if people want to read something, it's an amazing, amazing book, because when Anne Rule wrote it, I think it was 79 or 80 when it finally came out. She was a single mom of four who was trying to support her kids and herself by freelance writing for all these true detective magazines. And she got her first book deal to write about what at the time were called the Coed murders, and they later became the Ted Bundy killings, which were being committed by her good friend who worked next to her at a suicide hotline every week, Ted Bundy. And the book is really incredible because she does not let herself get away with anything. She doesn't hide from this. And it's got some of the most amazing set pieces. And I've always been astounded that no one's turned it into a movie, because it really is a really incredible story. She does really take herself to task by, did I just think I just saw this nice, good-looking middle-class white guy, and if I had seen something earlier and said something earlier, people would still be alive.
It's one of those books that that's talked about a lot, and I've read about a lot, but I haven't read itself yet, and I should. Yeah, it's fascinating, the concept of what the hell happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's what happens in this book. In I think now this would be harder to get away with, but maybe not. But there's a lot of parts of this country. I mean, I would say almost every part of this country where if you're a good looking middle class white guy with money who's got the right manners, people are going to really take you at face value and believe you are who you say you are. You look at the play 6 Degrees of Separation, which, the character isn't white, they're African American, but that plays on sort of the guilt of the people he cons his way into, they're the home of. And so it's, as long as you seem clean and well spoken and middle class and polite, I think guys and sometimes women are allowed to really get away with anything.
Talking about these true crime books, I brought up a technical question that I now have that I didn't know I had. How did you come up with each book of the month? Because they really line up with what's going on in the novel, and I thought that was pretty neat. So I just wondered how that all came about.
Oh yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate it. I worked really hard on that. It's funny. I originally, in the first couple of drafts, they were just a regular book club, and they were reading things like Madame Bovary, and I think Snow Falling on Cedars, and Dubliners, and Nectar Through the Sea, Sieve, and I was really lining up these plots of these books with the overlap with sort of Patricia's emotional journey, and then I realized, oh, this would be so much more fun if they were a true crime book club, and the problem was I didn't know a lot about true crime, and so I had to read a ton very quickly. And so then I could only really cover so many books, right?
Hmm.
So and I wanted them to be good. Like I wanted the books to be the big ones. I wanted them to be doing the classics because I wanted to read them. And so then it was just a matter of taking the 22 that I had time to read and figuring out which 12 fit which months the best. And some turned out to be duds. Like Robert Graysmith's Zodiac, which is a famous book. I mean, I remember seeing that when it first came out on the bookstore shelves. It's just not a very good book. It's well done and it's a good investigation, but it's very dry. I mean, it's like reading a book that's full of Law and Order SUV slug lines, or SVU, sorry, not SUV.
Yeah.
Slug lines. It's like everything is like, January 21st, Monday, 7:09 p.m., temperature 54 degrees. Like it's very, and I think that's because the Zodiac killer wasn't caught, and so Graysmith felt this need to present the evidentiary record for people. But in other books, like a lot of true crime books get really boring once the killer's arrested. Like, okay, they're in court, we know how this goes. Helter Skelter's more interesting in a lot of ways once they get to the courtroom stuff. But like, Joe McGinnis's Fatal Vision, which is a book I really like, I actually find the other book, I think it's called The Murderer and the Journalist, The Murderer and the Reporter, that was written about him writing this book, more interesting in terms of his relationship with the killer than this book is. I feel like McGinnis gets very defensive and sort of and tries to defend himself a lot in it. But the crime itself is fascinating. So they all had their strengths and weaknesses. Anne Rule was really the one I found who delivered every single time. Her books are really fantastic.
Excellent. The the look you put into assigning which true crime book is in each month, it does show. I don't know if anyone else has mentioned it yet, but it really shows.
No one has, but I really appreciate it because I spent a lot of time on that.
I can imagine you just going through each one and maybe even making like a map of them all. It makes sense, and it.
A map. Try several. Like I had calendars all over my office wall with the books written in.
My God, you became like an investigator of a true crime story.
Yeah, well, one of the nice things about having an office is you have all these walls. So I usually put up all the stuff for the book around me as I write. And so by the time I'm getting to the end, I look like I'm trying to piece together a really stupid conspiracy theory with all these like papers and calendars and schedules and weather reports.
Red string tying them all together to make the final connection.
Yeah, with all those conspiracy things, I'm never quite sure the role the red string plays, what exactly it's doing. But so I just sort of string it up randomly because I feels unfinished without it.
It looks cool. It makes it feel a good visual, at least.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks for doing this, Grady. This has been a lot of
Oh,
fun.
yeah, sure.
Um,
No, thank you. I really
yeah.
appreciate it. When this is ready to go live, send me the link and I'll make sure to sort of amplify and help get the word out.
Oh, thanks a lot. How can folks find you online? Speaking of being online.
Just GradyHendrix.com. My stupid website has all my social media stuff and my events that are coming up and all that jazz.
Thank you for listening to a new episode of Ghoulish. If you liked what you just listened to, hey, why not go leave a review on iTunes? Leave a little review. Support us on Patreon at patreon.com/PMM Publishing. I have a new book coming out pretty soon called Touch the Night. You can pre-order that from Cemetery Dance. I just released a new novella called We Need to Do Something about a family stuck in a bathroom. And through my small press, Perpetual Motion Machine, we just published the debut novella from Michael David Wilson called The Girl in the Video. So yeah, go get that. It's a good book. People like it, including me. And I wouldn't lie to you. Would I?